Welcome to Open Minds, a freedom of thought podcast series, interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today.
So after your time at Harvard Law School and at the Center for Libertarian Studies, you fulfilled your childhood dream. You went and became a Cook County criminal lawyer, a prosecutor. And one thing that really struck me about the book, because I've known you as a fellow academic and as a Supreme Court litigator, but this time in your life when you were a prosecutor in Cook County was really formative for you and really important for you. And it just shows up kind of scattered across the pages of the entire book, as well as centered in the chapters that are about that specific time in your life. Why is it so important to you? Why isn't it just, I had some jobs between college or after law school and before I became a professor, and they're not equally formative for me. Why was that one so formative for you?
Well, first of all, it was a boyhood dream come true. Secondly, it was better than television, and I was a big child of TV and I still am television focused. I watch TV. I don't read fiction novels hardly at all. And it was better than TV. It was more interesting than TV, which is really going to be the subject of my next book and why that was the case by going through all the details of what I did when I was a prosecutor. In this book, I give the flavor of that by talking about some of the amazing experiences I had as a student prosecutor and as a law clerk for the state's attorney's office, including one case of a person who was wrongfully accused of shooting a police sergeant, and how I got involved in that case, and how we ultimately ended up exonerating this guy, and the story behind all that, which I tell in this book because I say, well, that's part of my legal education, and I wish I could tell the story again in my other book, but I can't tell stories in both places. But it had a big effect on me because I learned how to build a case. Being a prosecutor, unlike being a defense attorney, being a prosecutor is an exercise of proving things. You have to, in fact, that's the first thing that any plaintiff's lawyer or prosecutor has to think about is how do I prove that? Now, it's kind of only secondarily what's true, assuming you know what's true. The second thing is, how do I prove it? And so you have to build a case, and then the other thing that was formative so that's important to building an intellectual argument. Defense attorneys spend most of their time knocking down the cases other people build. That's deconstruction, like some of our colleagues are into deconstructing. Well, deconstructing things is not the same thing as constructing things, and I'm a more constructing things guy. I am not a deconstructing things guy. It's actually the case that defense attorneys need to be able to construct cases, and then sometimes they're not able to because they don't have the skill set. That's, again, the subject of the next book. Anyway, the other thing is that you have to stand on your own 2 feet, and it's you, individual person, against everybody, because everybody has potentially an agenda. The defense attorney obviously does. The defendant obviously does. The complainant might have an agenda. The cops have their own agenda. In Cook County, the agendas were sometimes influenced by monetary corruption. The judge has their agenda. The clerks of the court have their agenda. And you, as the prosecutor, trying to get to a conviction or trying to get to a just outcome, you're oftentimes in the way of everybody else's agenda, and it's you. There's nobody around. I mean, you might have a partner, but by and large, it's the system against you, and you can't let yourself be gamed. You got to stand on your own 2 feet. You can't let yourself get. I mean, I'll give you one small little thing that's just symbolic of that. I did not make it personal when I prosecuted, even murderers. Some prosecutors like to during closing argument, like to stick their finger in the defendant's face to prove to the jury that, they're not afraid and whatever. I never did that. I never wanted to make it personal between me and the other side, between me and the defendant. But there was one case of a murder case that I prosecuted. I prosecuted it twice because there were 2 brothers and I had to prosecute each guy separately. And one of the brothers, he was intent on staring me down in court. Now, this is a big, tough guy, and if I was on the street, he'd make mincemeat out of me. Big, big, tough guy. And I'm not a tough guy, but this was my courtroom, and this is my house. And I'd be damned if I'm going to let this guy stare me down, because he was staring me down as a one-on-one personal matter. Nobody in the courtroom is going to know what's going on between me if I looked away when he's staring at me, but I could not let that happen. Didn't care what my instincts were to run or to not. I stared at him until he looked away. And I couldn't allow that to happen. I mean, I had another example of where a guy tried to intimidate my victim, a rape victim, and I was walking her from my office to the courthouse, and he turned out to have been a cousin of the defendant. I didn't know who he was, and he followed me. And he was a big, tall guy, and he got in the elevator, and he was like hovering over the two of us, trying to intimidate the victim who I was with. Which, I'm not a big, tough guy, but he's in my house. And so he was in the back of the courtroom. I go into the judge's chambers and I say, Judge, this is what happened. And the judge says, who I was on very good terms with, he said, well, what do you want me to do about it? I said, I want you to ask him to come into chambers with a court reporter and identify who he is. I want to know who he is. And that happened. So now I know who he is. And I figured that would be enough. That would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end of it. When the jurors were pulling out of the parking lot after they convicted his cousin of rape, he was standing out at the exit ramp with a pad of paper, writing down their license plate numbers and pointing at them with his pen as they were leaving. He was just a jerk. And so they called. I mean, I found this out because several jurors called me the next day in my office to complain. Now, I believed this guy was a blowhard. I don't think it was a threat. I don't think that really meant anything. But nevertheless, I had asked them to do their duty and convict these people. And they did their duty. And now they're asking me for help. I can't just blow them off. So I went to my supervisors and I asked for approval of felony charges of intimidating a juror. My supervisors turned me down because this is too nuts. This is right. So I looked in the statute book and I found that there was actually a misdemeanor within intimidating a juror. It's called communicating with a juror with the intent to influence their behavior.
Oh, okay.
Or because of their, and so it was
because of their behavior as well.
Right. And so it was a misdemeanor. I didn't need a supervisor's approval. But on the other hand, I'm sitting in a felony trial court. How do I get this thing done? So I wrote up a complaint. I went down to a misdemeanor court judge, a preliminary hearing court judge who I knew when he was a supervisor. I went into his courtroom and I swore out the complaint. I had him sign the complaint. But then I had to get the guy arrested. Now, how is that going to happen? So I sent notice to the Chicago Police District where the guy lived to try to, and they ignored it. There are warrant officers that are supposed to serve warrants, but they don't do anything. So I couldn't get him arrested. So what am I supposed to do? Instead, what I decided to do, this is a story. This is all going to be in my next book. But what I did instead is I said, in those days, prosecutors could sign time due slips that would give cops time off for the time they spent in court. So I called up the district commander, and I said, look, I will sign a week's worth of time due slips for any cop that arrests this guy with the warrant that's sworn out for him. Within 24 hours, he was in custody. And then he was being prosecuted, but he's prosecuted in misdemeanor court for a misdemeanor somewhere in the city, and misdemeanor prosecutors don't know what's going on. I didn't when I was. So I had to make a point to drive to whatever courtroom it was in and show up there and tell the assistant there what was going on. And eventually I agreed that he should be given supervision, which is the lightest thing. But here's the point. I had to let him know that when I'm in his house, when I'm on his streets, I'm not going to bother him. But when he's in my house, then that's my house. He can't violate my house rules. And the point, I think, was made.
What you're talking about is kind of entering into the next stage of adulthood, toughening up, getting more independent. I mean, that's what this first job represented to you, was becoming that sort of confident professional, which you don't have to do when you're a student.
And you don't necessarily have to do it when you're a professor either.
Yeah, that's true.
Most of our professors, it's very handy, Josh, when you're an academic, to have been a prosecutor before you were an academic.
Yeah. Because
there's a lot of academic politics and infighting, and it's nothing compared to what the criminal justice system is like. And it helps.
Yeah, good to have some perspective.
There are tools at your disposal. I don't need them very often, but sometimes you do need them, and when you need them, it's useful to have those skills. And it don't have to be a criminal prosecutor. You could be a plaintiff's lawyer.
Yeah, good to be just a lawyer.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so you get to the end of your time as a prosecutor and you teach a class and you're exploding with ideas. That comes across in the book really vividly. And you realize sort of like that acorn that was destined to become a tree. You were destined to be a person of ideas and a scholar and a teacher. You're destined to be a professor. But it isn't easy, and it isn't easy for anyone, really. I mean, lots of people would like to be a professor, especially a law professor, and the demands are very high. You have to be very successful in law school. Typically, you have to get certain kinds of clerkships and certain kinds of mentorships. You have to write things that impress other people and thought to be original and groundbreaking. And this is to say nothing of the very substantial ideological headwinds. So for the folks who don't know it in the audience, legal academia is quite radically and quite comprehensively a world of progressive liberals, ranging somewhere from a sort of New York Times liberal on the right to a social democrat, European social democrat on the left, or even more than that, a sort of more radical version of the same. So it's a very pervasively left.
You surprised me there for a minute as to how you define what was on the far left.
What's on the far left? Yeah, you're right. It goes well beyond European social democrat to something quite, I'm not even trying to characterize it, French revolutionary, something like that. So you became an academic despite considerable headwinds from all corners. I'm often asked by young people who are going to law school and really intellectually curious, should I try to become a legal academic? And I have very mixed feelings about encouraging it. I love my job. I've been successful in my profession, but there have been a lot of obstacles, some of which have been very disappointing. I know you encountered some of the same things, and I've seen people of immense talent fail unjustly because things just didn't work out for them, particularly because of the ideological bias. And so I'm curious, how you feel about that decision in retrospect. And when I say that, not given how well it's worked out for you, but putting yourself in the position you were then, was it foolhardy? Was it the right thing to do? Would you advise a young person now to do it?
I mean, in my case, I had nothing really to lose because I could be a criminal trial lawyer. I mean, I actually, when I went into the teaching market, the first time I didn't get a job at all. I raised the money to become a research fellow at the University of Chicago Law School, which changed my entire profile. Therefore, I went from virtually no interviews and no callbacks to a bunch of interviews and a bunch of callbacks. But I was on leave of absence from the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. If I hadn't gotten a job, I would have gone back and finished out my time there before I went on. So it wasn't that big a risk for me, even though it was very difficult. As I say, the first time I tried to do it, between my third and fourth year of being a prosecutor, I wiped out and got nothing. So I nowadays and also I spent 1 year as a research fellow, and that's the year it took to get me a job. So that was a cost in terms of income. It takes more now. You have to publish more. I actually did have several articles published, including one in Ethics, which is a peer-reviewed philosophy journal, one of the top 2 philosophy journals in the world, although it's not clear that law professors can evaluate ethics the way other academics, like philosophy professors, would. But now, to prepare yourself for the market, you have to, write a lot, and you have to oftentimes have gotten a fellowship, which was going to take you off your career path at a firm. You get a job at a big fancy law firm, and you can't just go off for 3 years or 2 years, then come back. So the opportunity costs are higher now. And then the question is whether the risks reward ratio are there in terms of what your chances are. It's still quite possible to get a job, and in some respects, for whatever reason, right now seems to be an improving time to get a job, even in constitutional law, even if you're on the other side. I don't want to tell stories about people who have I've seen where people are asking for applicants that would be more politically diverse. It's something's loosening up in the culture. I'm not exactly sure what it is. But it's hard to recommend somebody to do this. But look, I think to do this job well, you have to have a passion for it. And if you have a passion for it, then all these obstacles I'm describing, they can be dealt with. If you don't have a big enough passion for it to deal with all the obstacles, it's probably not for you. You're probably better off doing whatever you're doing and doing it well and making a lot of money and being move into the donor class and start getting so rich that you can give money to all the good things in the world. Peter Thiel was the president of his of his chapter of the Stanford Federalist Society at Stanford Law School. He's gone on to do some things, even though he never became an academic. If this is your calling, and I think this is my calling, it's the reason why I'm not I have no desire to be a judge. I would never have wanted that job because this is I've got my dream job. I mean, I've got a job at Georgetown which allows me to teach students who care about ideas. If this is your calling, then go for it. You can, and the Federalist Society actually has programs, the James Kent Academy and other support programs to help. And even the Center for the Constitution is about to initiate a new junior scholars program in which we help pre-tenure people, but also we help even people before they get into the job market that my new colleague, Stephanie Barclay, is going to be administering for us. And so it's doable if you really try. You're not guaranteed success, but it's worth it. And as you say, Josh, you love your job. I love my job. I can't imagine, it's my dream job. I can't imagine doing anything else with my life. And so if you think that's for you, then, but don't do it the way I did it. Be a better student. To those of you listening who are still either going into law school or don't become on the board of directors for the Center for Libertarian Studies like I did. Figure out what's inside your professor's head and do well on the exams, and then do law review, which I didn't do, and then get a clerkship, which I couldn't imagine. I don't think I knew what a clerkship was. I couldn't imagine why anybody wanted to do law review. That seemed like a bunch of scut work for no benefit.
It was.
But so that didn't bother me at all that I wasn't selected, and I wasn't close to being selected to any law review. And then I didn't get a clerkship. I didn't go to work for a fancy law firm. I didn't get all the credentials. It's much better if you go get those credentials. So do that. Don't do what I did.
It also might not be possible without those credentials now. I mean, the market has changed. So when I look at your story, the combination of being an ideological outsider and relative to the competition uncredentialed would be fatal to virtually, I can't even think of other folks like you who just sort of. If
I were on the appointments committee, as I have been many times, I wouldn't interview you.
Yes, right. When you disqualify yourself, you say, well, okay, I made some, but it did work out. Now, you started off at, was it Loyola Chicago?
Chicago-Kent.
Chicago-Kent. And
Loyola would have been a big step up.
Right. You started out at Chicago-Kent, and then it was Boston, and then
Boston
it was
University.
Georgetown.
Georgetown.
Can you talk about that? And you started out as a contracts professor.
Correct.
And remade yourself as a constitutional law professor. Can you just sort of talk about the path?
I mean, I went through the job market. I had 3 job offers: Northern Illinois, University of Florida, and Chicago-Kent. University of Florida would have been the safe pick. But my family's in Chicago. I love Chicago. I hope to spend my lifetime in Chicago. I was told, Richard Epstein told me, you can write your way out of anywhere, and it would have been my ideal to go to Northwestern or Chicago. And so I went to Chicago-Kent to be close to my family. I still think it was a big risk, and for years that I was there, I wondered if I'd made a big mistake by not taking Florida. But my kids got to know their grandparents, and our family had connections we never would have had if I'd have moved away. My brother moved to Texas, and his kids never had quite the same experience that my kids had. Mm-hmm. So that was great, and but it was tough moving up. And ultimately, I moved to Boston University. I tried to get a job at Northwestern. Northwestern faculty voted me down. That was kind of a kick in the teeth because I knew Chicago wasn't calling, and therefore I was going to have to leave Chicago to move up. And eventually, I got the attention of somebody at Boston University, even though that was never one of my target schools. But it was better than where I was, and I didn't know if I was going to ever do anything else than that. In the meantime, I did get invited to visit at Harvard Law School by Bob Clark, which boosted my spirits after having been rejected from Northwestern. And I'm always grateful. I'll always be grateful to him for that. I started at Boston University. My intent was to stay there and be happy because I was tired of not being happy. But over the years, I describe it. I don't want to talk about it now, but over the years, I started to get alienated from that place. And I was very lucky through a series of incidents, including another rejection from Northwestern, to get the job at Georgetown. If it weren't for Northwestern, I wouldn't have the job at Georgetown because the faculty at Northwestern unanimously voted to make me a lateral offer. And then the dean, David Van Zandt, refused to make the offer. But while that vote was hanging out there, I used that to get a visiting offer at Georgetown. And so had it not been for the faculty of Northwestern, I never would be at Georgetown, and I'm much better off at Georgetown than I ever would have been at Northwestern.
By the way, I wasn't at Northwestern when any of this was happening with your career, but had you joined the Northwestern faculty, you either would have been our most cited or one of our top 3 most cited members of our faculty. So this was the worst mistake I can possibly imagine on Northwestern's part.
Well, the rankings just came out earlier this week, and my dean emailed me. I didn't know it, but my dean emailed me to congratulate me on being the 11th most cited law professor in constitutional law.
Wow, that's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I just got a little. Apparently, I'm one of the 10 most cited people on the Scalia law faculty, and I just found out. That's a nice.
And Larry
nice thing for
Solem,
me,
I
too.
want to say, is number 12. And Larry points out to me that originalists constitute 9 of the 20 top cited constitutional law professors.
That's remarkable. And that actually brings me to my next question.
Originalism.
Originalism.
Yay,
What made
originalism.
you become an originalist? When did it happen in this period of your early academic development? I think one thing to highlight here is you didn't adopt originalism as your philosophy of the Constitution in law school and then go on to develop it as a young academic. It came much later in your career. So what was the story?
This is too long a story. You got to buy the book. But I will just say that I wasn't an originalist when I came out of law school. I was a student of Ronald Dworkin. I was an admirer of Ronald Dworkin. I thought his book, Law's Empire, was a masterpiece. I would have described myself as a Dworkinian. And what that meant was it is the moral readings theory of the Constitution, where you make the Constitution the best it could be. The best it could be would be the most libertarian it could be. And not what he thought the best it could be was, but the overall philosophy was that. But I was very interested in the original meaning of the Ninth Amendment because of the Federalist Society. I mean, I was a contracts professor because I grew to detest constitutional law as a law student because of the Supreme Court gutting the Constitution, what I later called the lost Constitution, where all the clauses the Supreme Court said didn't mean what you thought they mean, and they didn't operate the way you thought they would. No Ninth Amendment, no Second Amendment, no Privileges or Immunities Clause. Just go down the list of things that don't mean anything anymore.
It was more than the lost. It was the disappeared Constitution. Yeah. Just pieces of it just disappeared because we don't like those pieces.
Right. And so I just gave up on the Constitution as a law student, want to have nothing to do with it, and became a contracts professor because actually I was interested in developing essentially a libertarian theory of justice, and this was justice in contracts. I had Roberto Unger, a crit for my contracts professor. He was a very provocative teacher. I thought I could respond to his criticisms, and that's how I became a contracts professor. And then I got pulled into constitutional law, against my will, and it was because of the Federalist Society, which I didn't know anything about, but a student I'd taught at an IHS seminar invited me to speak at the Stanford Student Symposium, the 5th annual Student Symposium on the First Amendment, and I agreed to do it. And that's how it all started. And eventually, that's what immediately took me to the Ninth Amendment, of which I was interested. Then I became interested in the Second Amendment, the original meaning of the Ninth Amendment, the original meaning of the Second Amendment, but I was not an originalist. So what I had was cognitive dissonance.
Right.
I'm believing no originalism, I'm doing originalism. And that meant I was primed for a theory that would reconcile this tension. And the theory I found, and I'm the only person I think who became an originalist because I read The Unconstitutionality of Slavery by Lysander Spooner, which is a book that he published in 1845, arguing why we should not be following or adhering to the framers' intentions, which is what Justice Taney said in Dred Scott, and it's also what the radical abolitionists said, that the framers intended slavery, and therefore the Constitution was a covenant with death and agreement with hell. And Spooner's response was, we shouldn't care about the framers' intent. We only care about the original meaning of the words they wrote. And I read this and I went, oh, whoa, now this is a theory I might be able to do something with. I'd never heard this before. And I'm a theory guy. So I took Spooner's theory as I understood it, and I ran with it. I developed it, and 5 years later, I published Restoring the Lost Constitution, in which I explained the public meaning, the original meaning theory alternative to the framers' intent theory, and that's the theory that has come to dominate both academic originalists, but even more so the judges who are originalists. Virtually every judge who identifies as an originalist identifies as a public meaning originalist. Or an original meaning originalist, which is the theory that I got from Lysander Spooner, and then injected into the conservative legal movement in restoring the lost Constitution. But I have to give credit to one other person here, and that's Justice Scalia, because unbeknownst to me, he himself had made a similar move for different reasons, and had been telling when he was on the D.C. circuit, he was meeting with the lawyers in the Meese Justice Department, many of whom have become law professors, Michael Rappaport, John McGinnis, John Manning, and he was pushing original meaning. He said you shouldn't be because he was against legislative history as a regulation guy. And so constitutionally, we shouldn't be looking at their personal intent, their subjective intent. We need the meaning of what the words they said. That was of great help to me, because when I come into it from a theoretical standpoint as a libertarian, it's really nice to have Nino Scalia coming in it as a conservative justice, and we're both arguing for the same position. He's arguing it very polemically, very effectively. We wouldn't be where we were without his indefatigable willingness to debate everybody and anywhere as a justice. And I come at it from a legal theory standpoint, trying to put flesh on the bones and make it a theoretically robust position that can withstand the criticisms of the left. And then probably my most important convert was Larry Solom, who also was not an originalist until he read my work, and then became an originalist and sort of transcended me in his ability to do philosophy of language and talk about what meaning really is, et cetera. And so that's kind of that's the intellectual history of the story that I tell at much greater detail in the book.
So just so our audience understands, Lysander Spooner, I mean, these are the abolitionists. These are the constitutional abolitionists of the pre-Civil War era. These are folks who are not denouncing the Constitution because of its compromises with slavery as a covenant with death. They're defending the Constitution in really creative ways that might not have otherwise been envisioned, and that's what converted you, was that pre-Civil War kind of era of constitutional thinking.
That's where I got the position from, and then I had to develop a theory about, or my own decision about whether it's correct or not.
How did it cohere in the end with your libertarianism? What's the connection there? Because it doesn't seem like there's any logically necessary connection between originalism and libertarianism.
There isn't, but there is a connection between means and ends, between constitutionalism as the law that governs those who govern us. We need to subject those who govern us, our agents in government, to law. A written constitution is the way to do that. And then the written constitution, the people that are to be governed by that law should not be able to change it to what they like better, any more than we can change the laws they impose on us.
So it comes from a commitment to limited government. It comes from the idea that libertarianism can only thrive, a libertarian society, when you have quite strictly limited government, and our Constitution, our original Constitution, is a good way of creating limited.
I mean,
government.
that's a somewhat oversimplified, I'm not rendition of this. I mean, it does also matter a lot. The substance of what the Constitution says matters. The original meaning is the substance, and the substance has to be good enough to provide a just legal system, which I think ours is, if it were followed, which it's not. My theory of legitimacy, of constitutional legitimacy, which I develop in Restoring the Lost Constitution, is not like others, which is all based on democratic majoritarianism. The people adopted it, that makes it right, and that makes it good. The people may have adopted it, but that doesn't automatically make it right or good. What makes it right or good is the substance of what it says. And the original meaning is its meaning. First of all, in order to know whether the substance is good, you have to know what it says.
Right.
Original meaning is what it says. And now the second question is what it says good enough to have a system that's going to produce laws that bind in conscience, in the words of Aquinas, on the people upon whom they're being imposed? And I think that our system is such a system.
Yeah, there's a happy marriage between what the Constitution really means if you apprehend its original public meaning,
right,
and the fact that it's a good Constitution that should command our adherence and conscience.
Right, because our original Constitution was written by proto-liberals who believed in much the same values. Unfortunately, some of them also practiced slavery. Not all of them. Some of them were very ardently opposed to slavery, but some of them ultimately ended up being for it. And that led to a struggle that culminated in a revised Constitution that's revised by the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. And so the Constitution that I subscribe to today, that any of us listening need to decide whether you think is good enough or not, is not the original Constitution. it's the Constitution that's been amended 27 times.
Yeah.
The original meaning of that Constitution needs to be legitimate. And it was greatly improved by the Republicans in Congress who proposed the Reconstruction Amendments.
So this brings us to two of the biggest cases you've been involved in. Well, really, they're two of the biggest cases in constitutional history. I'm thinking here of Gonzales v. Raich and of Sebelius. So for the audience, Gonzales v. Raich is the medical marijuana case, which you tried before the Supreme Court. Sebelius is the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare case, which I don't believe you argued in front of the Supreme Court, but you were intimately involved with and with a theoretical backbone of. Both of them are in every common law textbook as the latest, most important statements about the limits of federal power under the Commerce Clause. And one thing I learned from your book is there were a few other aspects of these cases when they were in their development phases, but that's what they're remembered for, is their Commerce Clause meaning. Now, I teach these cases, and I think, like everyone, like most constitutional lawyers, I thought that they were setbacks for the project of a limited federal government. And I want to read now an email I sent to you when I was using your constitutional law casebook to teach my students, and I wrote you about Gonzales v. Raich. So here's what I said. Randy, I've always had the sense that Raich ended the Commerce Clause revolution that Lopez and Morrison had started. We thought for a glimmering moment that the federal government really did not have the police power via the Commerce Clause, that the court would rein future excesses in along the economic and nature line. And then Raich showed that the court wasn't willing to do that and returned the federal government to roughly the position it was before Lopez. And your response to that email totally changed my take on the case. Rather than reading it aloud here, why don't we talk about it a little bit? How do you see the Raich case and the Sebelius case and the relationship between them? And why was my sense that these were setbacks and that these were restoring they were really, I guess for the benefit of our listeners, for a long time, after the New Deal, the federal government had virtually plenary power, notwithstanding the original Constitution, which made it a government of limited power. The federal government had virtually plenary power, and the constitutional vehicle for that plenary power was largely the Commerce Clause. Not exclusively the Commerce Clause. Spending had something to do with it, but the Commerce Clause was largely the vehicle of it. And then during the Rehnquist Court, there were a series of revolutionary cases. The most famous of them are Lopez and Morrison, in which the court announced that the federal government's power is not unlimited, that they really have to be dealing with something commercial in nature if they are authorized, if the federal government is authorized by the Commerce Clause. And that, for many constitutional conservatives, was thought to be a revolutionary moment in American constitutional history, where once again we would have a limited federal government and a more robust state-level government. And then the revolution appeared to ground to a halt with the two next big cases that followed, which were Gonzales v. Raich, the medical marijuana case, and Sebelius, the Affordable Care Act case. But maybe it's not so. Maybe there's another take on those cases. And so let me invite you now, Randy, to sort of tell me why my initial instinct was wrong.
Well, I think I can read upside down. My answer to you is yes and no.
Right.
So yes and no.
Right.
It's not so wrong. I mean, it was a blow that we lost the Raich case. I certainly hope we'd win it. I never necessarily thought we'd win it. And in some respects, I beat the spread by getting 3 votes. We got Chief Justice Rehnquist, Justice O'Connor, and Justice Thomas to vote for our side. So it was a blow. It was a setback for the project of limiting the federal government or holding it to its enumerated powers, which we aren't really very close to, even to this day. We're not close to it. But it wasn't as big a setback as people think, in part because the majority of the court, rejected the capacious theory of the government that would have essentially given Congress a plenary power. That is the position we're trying to reject. that Congress doesn't have what you might call a national problems power, a power to address any national problem that the Congress thinks is a national problem. That's really what the left wants Congress to have, and thought they had gotten from the New Deal. But the Rehnquist Court said, no, there must be a limiting principle in any claim of federal power that will not lead to the outcome that the Congress has unlimited power. That was the limit. If the establishment of the limiting principle is the key move that the Rehnquist Court made. This far and no farther without a limiting principle, a judicially administrable limiting principle. Now, did Raich do away with that? It did not, because the way that Justice Stevens justified the outcome in Raich is to say that under Lopez, Congress can reach and regulate intrastate activity that's economic in nature. Of course, we argued that raising marijuana to consume yourself is not economic. That's why we had a case. And what the court held is that based on a 1966 Webster's Dictionary definition of economic, the production of a commodity is economic activity. And since you're producing a commodity, it's economic. So he didn't reject the principle of Raich, of Lopez and Morrison. He applied it, purported to stay within it by giving the term economic a 1966 dictionary definition meaning. No, that was a loss. It was too bad, but it was not the end of the world, as it turns out.
So let me say a few things just for those in our audience who are not lawyers. In a big Supreme Court case, there's a winner and a loser, but there's also a line of reasoning, and both matter. Who wins matters to the future of the law, but also the reasoning that is endorsed by the court matters to future cases. And what the medical marijuana, what Raich did, was it accepted the reasoning that the federal government can regulate economic activities. It can't regulate necessarily non-economic activities, and it can't pretend that everything under the sun is economics. What it can do instead is, what the court said is, growing medical marijuana, even for your own use, is economic activity. Now, you might disagree with that,
right?
But they didn't they didn't reject the principle that the underlying activity has to be economic, and they affirmatively accepted the principle that the federal government is not one of unlimited powers.
Right.
And both of those were huge victories in terms of the reasoning of the case.
Right. Well, it kept us going. I mean, we didn't advance the ball, but the ball it wasn't as big a setback as we all thought it was.
Yeah.
Now, it was true that at the end of the Raich case, if you'd have asked me, I would have said, well, under this reasoning, there probably isn't anything that Congress could seek to do that the court would not ultimately uphold. And also particularly under the reasoning that Justice Scalia had in his concurring opinion. He was the sixth vote, and he had a concurring opinion I don't want to get into now, but it was all based on the necessary and proper clause. Because ultimately, the thing that law professors don't understand is all of these Commerce Clause cases, dating back to the New Deal, are not actually Commerce Clause cases at all.
Right.
They're necessary and proper clause cases, so you have to have
It's
a theory.
in McCulloch v. Maryland, too.
Yeah, you have to. Well, it hooks up with McCulloch. They do not hook up with Gibbons. Gibbons is the Commerce Clause case. These are all descendants of McCulloch. And that's why the New Deal court cites McCulloch in crucial point. They don't cite Gibbons. And so therefore, you have to have a theory of the necessary and proper clause. And Justice Scalia had a pretty capacious one in his concurring opinion. And that his opinion is somewhat problematic. It's not wrong analytically. What makes it problematic is the deference he's going to show Congress in deciding whether something is essential to a broader regulatory scheme or not.
When I think about this now, in the wake of your email, and which greatly affected how I taught the case, I always have sort of bifocals. Because on the one hand, in Gonzalez v. Raich, what the court ultimately said is growing marijuana consistent with state law in your own yard for your own smoking because you have a doctor's prescription is economic activity, interstate economic activity in some sense.
It doesn't need to be interstate. Under Lopez and Morrison, it could be intrastate. It just needs to be economic.
Right. It's economic activity that is regulable under the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Right.
That's what I was trying to say.
Right.
And when you just put the facts next to that conclusion, it seems like, okay, they can regulate anything at all.
Right.
They could regulate me practicing music at home with my kids.
Right. And that's why we brought the
activity.
case. We brought this case. I was one of the lawyers that brought the case because we wanted facts that were like that.
On the other hand, the details of Justice Stevens' reasoning do not undermine Lopez and Morrison, not if you closely scrutinize the reasoning. And so on the one hand, my focus on the reasoning and the doctrine lawyer's hat says this case is not a setback, or not as big a setback as it could be for the Federalist Revolution. And when I just think about the facts, I think, no, it's just as big a setback as it appears. And
so for anyone who's listening this long into the podcast,
right,
which may be 5 people, but whoever's still listening to this podcast, one of the things that I do try to do in this book, which is somewhat unusual for a memoir, is I try to explain the logic of these cases from the inside, because I developed the theories of both cases. And this actually helps you understand. If you're a law student, it will help you understand this whole area of doctrine better, because I actually get substantive in the book to try to explain what we've just been talking about. And then I'll just briefly transition to NFIB, which of course was a huge loss for the country by getting the upholding the Federal Care Act. But it was actually a pretty big victory for the Constitution, again, because of the reasoning that the court refused to adopt, which was the reasoning offered by the government, which is essentially that Congress could regulate anything if it was necessary and proper to a broad regulatory scheme. And by regulate, it also meant it could make you actually it could make you engage in economic activity. So after Raich, we couldn't imagine anything that the Congress might do that would be beyond Raich. But we never even imagined as a hypothetical that instead of prohibiting you from growing marijuana in the backyard, they would claim the power to make you grow marijuana in the backyard. We didn't even have that as a slippery slope hypothetical. That was how beyond our comprehension it would be, but that's exactly what they did.
And yet, when the Affordable Care Act was written, the majority of constitutional law professors said this is a slam dunk from a Commerce Clause perspective.
Including conservative
objection?
Including conservative law professors.
So what did they miss? What did you internalize in the wake of Lopez and Morrison and Raich, which you tried, whose theory you developed? What principles had you internalized that made the Affordable Care Act constitutionally problematic in ways others couldn't see?
Because I understood it was a necessary and proper clause case and not a Commerce Clause case.
And so we never so Raich was about whether there's any limits on necessary in the necessary and proper clause. And the position of Lopez and Morrison says yes. No matter how necessary you think something is, Congress thinks something is, they can't reach wholly intrastate non-economic activity. It doesn't matter how necessary it is. It's categorically beyond their reach under the necessary part of the necessary and proper clause. But there's also a proper part of the necessary and proper clause that at that point had only been asserted by Justice Scalia in the Prince case, which made commandeering of the states an improper, no matter how necessary it might be, it is improper for Congress to reach and commandeer state officials. Well, I wrote an article in the course of this litigation called Commandeering the People, because instead of commandeering the states, Congress was commandeering each one of us to do business with a private company. And therefore, it was an improper, notwithstanding how we insisted it was necessary to the Affordable Care Act. The individual insurance mandate was necessary. That's the reason why it was not severable, because it was integral part of it, absolutely necessary to make it work, which is why the whole law has to go down. But we said it was not proper. And it was not proper for the following reasons. And what law professors had always missed about these cases is that these are necessary and proper clause cases. And there is, in this case, the only authority we really had for this was New York versus United States and Prince. And of course, they had a different problem with propriety, with states' rights, but individual. The 10th Amendment is not limited to states. It says shall be reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
Mm-hmm.
So this was essentially a 10th Amendment argument about going too far, so that that the assertion of the necessary and proper clause was you were exceeding the original meaning of the necessary and proper clause. And then the other thing that was key to the litigation, which was the key move that I made, but I made this with the help of my co-author in this Heritage Fund memorandum, who spotted a Congressional Research Services report about Hillary Care that basically said it was unprecedented to make people buy a private product. And it was the unprecedented nature of the act, which of course they tried to argue there were precedents, but it was the unprecedented nature of it, which meant no Supreme Court precedent strictly applied to this. By definition, if it's never been done before, you could take the logical extension of precedent, but there's been no precedent specifically saying Congress can do this. And as soon as you get stare decisis out of the way, now we have some room to run.
So
that was the other thing that I got, which I got with the help of my co-author. But I even got it before what he found is the Congressional Research Service that said this. But I had a blog post on the Arena in September of 2009, which was commenting on an article by David Rivkin in the Wall Street Journal about whether the individual insurance mandate is constitutional. And I worked all this unprecedented stuff right into my first take on this in September. The bill comes out, doesn't get passed until the Christmas Eve in the Senate and March. So it's the logic of the doctrine plus the unprecedented nature of this act, which created the challenge.
Did you lose? I mean, in some sense, you lost in the same way as Gonzalez v. Raich. You lost the case. I mean, the Affordable Care Act was upheld, but many of the principles you were advocating were actually endorsed by the court. So it's that same sort of bifocals. It's a yes and no.
But we did better, even better.
Right.
Number one.
Can you talk about that?
Number one, we got 5 votes for our theory that was dismissed as frivolous when I first made it.
Right.
5 votes, including Justice Roberts, and I quote a lot about Justice Roberts.
To be clear, the idea that the federal government under the Commerce Clause can force you to buy a product from a private company, like forcing you to buy, I don't know,
that's unconstitutional.
Vitamins, unconstitutional.
The 5-justice majority held that was unconstitutional.
So why didn't the Affordable Care Act go down?
Well, because of Chief Justice Roberts adopting a saving construction in which he said it was fairly possible to construe the statute as though it was not a requirement to buy health insurance.
Right.
If it was a requirement to buy health insurance, then that would be unconstitutional. But it could be construed as being an option to buy health insurance or pay a non-coercive tax. So the first thing we won is that we ended the claim that the federal government could impose purchase mandates. In fact, it had never done it before because it was unprecedented. It has never done it since, and it's not going to do it because it's unconstitutional, Josh. We won that. But here's the second thing we won. By having it upheld as a tax, because the tax was not coercive, what Roberts took off the table was all the punishment that could be associated with a Commerce Clause regulation. If it had been upheld as a Commerce Clause regulation and you didn't have insurance, that modest tax was not going to stay modest for long.
Sure.
It was going to increase to a major penalty. The statute says penalty. And there's absolutely no reason why Congress couldn't have amended it and called for incarceration of people who don't have health insurance. All of that was prevented.
Can I put that a somewhat different way? The Sebelius case did not expand the Commerce Clause. It did not expand it. In fact, it affirmed all the previous limitations on the Commerce Clause.
And added, and yes, it did, and added more because we'd never thought about mandates before, and now they're off the table.
So just one last question about these cases. How'd you end up being a Supreme Court litigator? How did it happen? It sounds like it was really one of the highlights of your career,
Sure.
Taking these 2 big cases to the Supreme Court. What led someone who starts life as a contracts professor, becomes a constitutional originalist?
How about somebody who just tried murder cases to juries?
Right. How did you end up being before the Supreme Court?
Let's leave this for the people to buy the book and find out.
All right. It's a great story, folks. If you wanna read the story, I have one last question. And there's a question goes back to your Aristotelian roots. It has to do with paths to living a meaningful life, to living a meaningful life as a professor of anything, and in particular, to living a meaningful life as a law professor. There's this sense on every page of your book, and it's more powerful than any statement you could make to this effect, that you have lived a good life. It was a life of meaning and purpose and achievement, but also of considerable happiness in the ordinary sense of joy, pleasure.
Joy, big on joy.
Yeah, you and Joy, you and Kamala. What advice would you have for others for achieving a life of meaning, purpose, and achievement and joy? And in particular for other professors, even other law professors, on these paths to a meaningful life?
Well, maybe the first easiest to understand one is live your life as though you're going to write a memoir about it. Because think about what that would entail. You want to do things that you're going to be proud of. having done and tell other people about. And you're going to want to avoid doing things that you're ashamed of and that you don't want to tell other people about. And so if that's kind of your criteria, how would this look? How will this look in my memoir when I write it? And by the way, my secondary point is everybody should write a memoir for their family, not to publish it at the very minimum, but they should at least write it down so their descendants can know what they did. But that's a secondary point. But the happiness part is live your life as though you're going to write a memoir. It's very Aristotelian because Aristotle thought you're not going to know whether you've lived a good life until the end. You do everything right around the way, but nobody's truly happy until it's all over and done with, and then you see whether you made it or not, whether you satisfied, you were really truly human. So that would be the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is what really has motivated me. I said justice is what motivated me, but even more basic than that is I wanted to leave the world a better place. And I think the first way one does that is by having a family and by raising good kids. That helps you leave the world a better place. And if you've done nothing other than that, you've made the world a better place. I've done that. I'm very proud of my kids, and now I'm very proud of my grandkids. But in addition to that, I thought being an academic was a way to do that. Being a scholar was a way to do that because I would make the world a better place, not if everybody agrees with me or if my views get put into law, but I would make the world a better place if I could contribute to the store of human knowledge. And the only way to contribute to the store of human knowledge, to improve the state of human knowledge, is to write it and publish it. If you just have it in your head, you have not made the world a better place. You have to get it out of your head. And of course, I can't think all these things through in my head anyway. The way I develop my ideas is in my word processor. It's an interactive process between me and the word processor as we develop this idea back and forth. And so it's got to be out of my head, and then it's got to be out in the world to be discovered, just like I was able to discover Lysander Spooner's book, The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, had been written 150 years before. No other law professor had read it. I read it. It was out there waiting for me, Randy Barnett, to discover it and create an originalist theory that has now dominated the legal system. That's what Lysander Spooner did. That's what all of us can do. Do not make your happiness contingent on changing the world, on changing everybody's opinion, because then your happiness is out of your control. Make your happiness contingent on that which is within your control. And what's within your control is developing an idea, as an academic or an intellectual, developing an idea and publishing it and making it available to the world for whoever cares to look at it or not.
So you've had the additional happiness of seeing your ideas take hold and have great impact on the world. That part you can't control. But what you can control is you have a vision, you get that vision out on paper. You get it out there and into the world for people to evaluate.
Yeah, let me stress. I hardly write anything to persuade other people. What I write for my own satisfaction, which is to try to figure out what do I think is just, what do I think is right, what do I think is right, and that's the way I work it out. So I'm kind of working it out for my own benefit. Me knowing it is a benefit to me, and then if other people are attracted to it, so much the better.
Yeah, you sort of have to trust people to read it and love it if they love it.
Love it if they love it. I mean, I wrote this book. I had no idea if anybody was. That's why you said to me, this come full circle, and we can wrap this up. The compliment you paid in the beginning to the book and how readable you thought it was and how enjoyable you thought it was, I had no idea. I wrote the book because this is what I was going to do. I was going to make a record of what I'd done with my life, primarily for my kids and my grandkids and my descendants who will never meet me in person. And I was going to make a record, and then I'm going to teach some lessons and hopefully entertain people, but I have no idea how people are going to respond. When I hear somebody responding the way you did at the beginning of this podcast, then I'm just very, very happy.
That is a nice place to end. Why don't we end with me saying again, I just loved reading the book, and I will take many of its lessons to heart. I'll be thinking about it for years to come. So thank you. Thank you for writing the book.
Thanks, Josh, for having me.